I don't know if the MCU's X-Men is gonna work. So with the Marvel Cinematic Universe bidding farewell to many of its legacy players in Avengers Endgame, things would be looking a bit quiet for the MCU going forward if it weren't for the new inclusion of the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. Yes, there's stuff to look forward to, but the big hype objects going forward are going to be Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. And don't get me wrong, I am looking forward to these, but I do have my doubts as to how well the X-Men is going to work in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And this is nothing against the X-Men, and this is nothing against the Marvel Cinematic Universe either. And I think there are some parts of the X-Men that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is absolutely gonna nail. I have no doubts that they're gonna get the mystique of the school for gifted youngsters really down pat. And I think one thing that I guess we can expect from the Marvel Cinematic Universe that we never got from the Fox movies is that we might get some comic book accurate costumes for these characters. I mean, fingers crossed. But here's the part where I think these two aren't gonna go together very well. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, whether you love it or you loathe it, is reductive. These films are crowd pleasers designed to make you feel good and make you feel hyped. The reason everybody loves these movies is because they do give a certain level of validation to the audience, and they don't necessarily challenge the audience. There's rarely a time where an MCU movie is difficult to watch. That's not to say that they haven't explored real-world issues to some small depth, but it's usually in service of a fun action romp. MCU movies can get incredibly intense, but they rarely like to actually delve into dark subject matter. I'm not saying they never do this, but they don't do this enough for me to feel confident that they're gonna necessarily get the X-Men right. I'll give some examples here. Ant-Man, for one. Hank Pym is a very complicated character in the comic books. Hank Pym has had a tendency in those comic books to delve into domestic abuse territory. This is a guy that's hit his partner, and he even kidnapped the Wasp to marry her. Hank Pym was no cut-and-dry superhero, and he was definitely not always likable. So why do you think Hank Pym was sidelined into a mentor figure in the films with none of that touched upon? Now, I recognize that Scott Lang has also been Ant-Man in the comics, but he was never the main one. Why do you think they chose Scott Lang for these movies? So they could make him into a Paul Rudd archetype so the audience could have a lot of fun with Ant-Man, a fun family film. We all love Mantis from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. She's such a lovable, innocent character. She wouldn't hurt a fly. Did you know that in the comics, Mantis was a prostitute? We all love Hawkeye. He's the swashbuckling heart of the Avengers team. He is the humanity of the Avengers. In the comics, he's deaf. Ain't Thor such a funny guy? We all love the God of Thunder, who definitely has no alter ego whatsoever. Oh wait. God, the story of Nebula is such a rich and dark story, but it never gets fully explored in its own film. Instead, she is a side character, with her origins only lightly touched upon. Now, do not mistake this for me complaining here. I love the MCU versions of these characters. Marvel Comics characters are time-worn characters enriched over decades of comic book history. The Marvel Cinematic Universe process is to take this, strip away all of the history, and boil it down to a very fine archetype that suits a cinematic audience that the mainstream are just gonna love. And for the most part, they will look and talk enough like their comic book counterparts for people to not complain. However, they won't necessarily have that rich history attached to them, and all of the darker aspects of these characters will only be lightly touched upon. They will be there in service of how and who the character is now, but we won't necessarily see that play out, in favor of keeping things light and fun to please a mainstream audience. There is nothing wrong with this, but it has to be acknowledged that this doesn't necessarily suit every single Marvel character. For the most part, people don't complain. It makes for an enjoyable film, and a lot of these characters are not so ingrained in the public consciousness that people necessarily know what's missing. Marvel does a good job at making these characters feel complete. However, in the recent years, it's become quite evident that some folks have drawn a line in the sand where Spider-Man is. Spider-Man is a character that tends to go through a lot. There's a lot of drama in his day-to-day life. He's a guy that's often surrounded by death and misery. He's got a dead uncle, he's got a girlfriend that dies, and his best friend secretly hates his guts. The Marvel Cinematic Universe opts to not explore that side of the character, in favor of making more like coming-of-age comedies and focusing more on Spider-Man's superhero adventures. Now, I personally think Spider-Man has more than demonstrated that he makes for a great genre buster, and he can do different genre stories better than characters like, say, Iron Man and Captain America. He works well on a pretty universal level, so as long as you get Spider-Man right, it almost doesn't kind of matter what story you put him in. So I therefore think the Marvel Cinematic Universe works well for Spider-Man, but I don't think this approach is going to work well with the X-Men. Now, you'll forgive me if I get a few facts wrong here, my girlfriend is more the X-Men buff than I am, but I really don't think X-Men movies are going to work as crowd-pleasing fun blockbusters. The X-Men have always been an allegory for the civil rights movement. Within the stories of the X-Men, there's always been this theme of racial conflict, how these folks are oppressed just for the way they were born. And with that comes debate, and with that debate you've got two figureheads. You've got Professor Charles Xavier, who wants to work towards peace and understanding between mutant and humankind. Then you've got Magneto, who's got a more aggressive stance towards his human oppressors. It's like the difference between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. In order to make that story work, you need to properly set up the human and mutant kind conflict, and it needs to be done on a scale that makes the mutants convincing. In order to do that, we're gonna need to see some scenes of the humans truly being awful to the mutants. We need to see proper oppression scenes. I don't think that's gonna necessarily work with Marvel's crowd-pleasing formula. Here's another example of a character that I don't think will bode well with Marvel's formula of a crowd-pleasing fun family blockbuster. Nightcrawler, who is a part of the rumored Marvel X-Men lineup. Nightcrawler carries a lot of themes of self-harm. As we know, his body is covered in self-inflicted brands and scars, and he's done this for his every sin because he practices Catholicism. He hates himself for who he is. This is not a man that has been at peace with himself. I don't really trust Marvel to really portray that right. As we know, Marvel is very reductive and they don't like to go into that subject matter. If you want to know the rest of the rumored lineup, it's Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Thunderbird, Sunfire, Havoc, and Storm. Now, I think that's a good lineup. I like what I'm seeing there. I mean, one thing I like is that we're not seeing Wolverine in there. Do I think Marvel should touch Wolverine again? Kinda, but kinda not. I am in two minds about it. On one hand, we've had a lot of really, really good Wolverine movies, and with Hugh Jackman, we've had a good portrayal of Wolverine. Sure, it didn't work every single time, but when it did work, it worked just fine. I, like many others, am happy to call it there and say, that's Wolverine done. On the other hand, though, from a marketing perspective, it's a good idea to have Wolverine in the marketing somewhere. Marvel movies often appeal to the mainstream, and to the mainstream, Wolverine is the X-Men. So it would be a good idea to include him somewhere, but I don't want him to be included as the main character. I'd say treat him as like a wild card. He's the big guns, you know? So like it could be like the final battle or something, the action's really going, it looks like all is lost, but then boom, suddenly Wolverine comes running in there kicking ass. Like, your movie could be as depressing as you want it to be, but that would be a crowd-pleasing moment that would suit Marvel down to the teeth. And also, I would love to see Wolverine don his classic yellow outfit, but really, if all we're talking about here is a costume change to justify his return, I wouldn't deem that enough of a justification for it. And as for who would play him, like, that's a difficult thing. I think Hugh Jackman did a wonderful job. I guess going forward, maybe they should consider someone that matches more his sort of look in the comic books, so get a short, stocky guy to play the role. Somebody under 6 foot. But again, let's remember, Marvel Studios are the people that put Robert Downey Jr. on platform shoes so that he could appear as tall as Pepper Potts. Now look, please don't take this as me saying the X-Men in the MCU is definitely going to suck. What I'm saying is, the X-Men in the MCU as we know it, as it currently stands, wouldn't work. The X-Men would need to be an evolution of the MCU, because an X-Men movie cannot just be some crowd-pleasing family film. The X-Men needs to be darker, it needs to be more thought-provoking, it needs to be more serious. It can't just be a squad of conventionally attractive dudes named Chris standing in line smiling and laughing at a faceless army. It needs to go beyond, it needs to change. Now, I think Marvel have demonstrated that they do have the capability to change the formula up a bit. I think Infinity War could be a good indication of that. It's just that with the X-Men, you can't just go and do an endgame and make everybody happy again. I'm not saying the film needs to be depressing, it can't be this light and fun thing. On the bright side though, I think the Fantastic Four are gonna work in the Marvel Cinematic Universe just fine. It's one of those things where I guess maybe better than making X-Men movies, it would be better if X-Men were characters in other Marvel movies. And they've kind of already dabbled with that a little bit with Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. We'll see when it comes, and I hope for the best. I just don't think that things the way they are right now are going to necessarily suit the X-Men. And before anyone says it, because I know they're gonna say it in the comments section, no, I personally don't want Deadpool to be in an X-Men movie. Deadpool is Deadpool and he works in Deadpool. I know that in the comics he was a part of the X-Men, but in films there's a lot of convincing and world building going on that Deadpool is just going to ruin if you have him breaking the fourth wall. If they're going to include him in an X-Men movie or any other Marvel movie for that matter, he needs to be dialed back a bit. He can't be breaking the fourth wall. He can't be self-aware. And at that point, you've just got a witty, jovial character. The X-Men is tricky. That's part of what makes it so good. I'm just hoping that Marvel will do that justice. So Marvel have a very big task ahead. What do you think, guys? Comment below and discuss, and as always, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, why don't you head over to channelpub.net, where you can visit our blog page Dr. Blogtopus, but you can also buy merch, such as this tasteless t-shirt. And I mean, if you insist here, guys, maybe hit subscribe, maybe hit the like button, and in the description below are the links to my social media handles, including the Patreon, where your contribution can help me run this channel, and really keep it alive. That aside, I am really grateful that you checked out this video today. Thank you so much for watching, fellow home dog. See you on another video.